They came here because they knew and understood that Minnesota was a place where taxpayer money could be taken with little risk and few consequences.
America, two men from Philadelphia just pled guilty to flying to Minnesota and stealing $3.5 million from a homeless housing program.
According to the Department of Justice, about $3.5 million. The two men pleading guilty.
They were using AI, including ChatGPT, to create fake records when insurance companies started asking questions. This is the first federal case charging criminals with using artificial intelligence to commit healthcare fraud.
How is the Minnesota state government, the executive branch in particular, not implicated or complicit in allowing fraud to be rampant?
What is up, guys? Tyson DeLaCruz here. Thank you so much for rocking with me. Let me show you how Minnesota became America's fraud tourist destination while Timmy Tampon Walsh pretended everything else was fine. Anthony Jefferson and Lester Brown, both from Philadelphia, heard that Minnesota's Housing Stabilization Service Program was easy cash, easy money. So they flew to Minneapolis, rented an office space, and started marketing themselves as the housing guys.
Federal prosecutors call them fraud tourists. Two men, both from Philly, accused of traveling here to Minnesota to exploit holes in the state's social service programs in order to line their own pockets.
Here's how this scam worked. They deliberately targeted shelters and Section 8 housing to enroll individuals in Minnesota's Housing Stabilization Services Program. This is a Medicaid benefit designed to help people with disabilities, mental illness, and substance abuse disorders find and maintain housing. It is a good program in theory, but Jefferson and Brown turned it into a cash machine. They enrolled 230 beneficiaries through inflated and fraudulent billing. They billed Medicaid for services that were obviously never actually provided. And when insurance companies started asking questions, started peeping around the corner, they used ChatGPT and other AI tools to create fake records and cover their tracks.
According to the DOJ, is that this represents the first charges involving the use of artificial intelligence to further a fraud scheme targeting healthcare programs in Minnesota, with the two fraudsters concealing the scam by using AI, including ChatGPT.
They weren't just stealing money, they were using AI, cutting-edge technology, to hide the theft. And Minnesota's oversight was so weak that they got away with $3.5 million before anybody caught them. Now, let me show you Minnesota's response to this fraud. We know what it is because it perfectly illustrates how Democrat-run states handle corruption. Instead of prosecuting the fraud earlier, instead of implementing basic oversight, Minnesota just shut down the entire Housing Stabilization Service Program because the fraud had become so widespread. The program was designed to help seniors, people, again, with mental illness, substance abuse disorders, things like that. Legitimate people needed help finding particular housing. But the fraud got so bad after several years of explosive growth that the state just shut it down. So now people who actually needed the program are out of luck because Minnesota couldn't be bothered to prosecute the fraud when it was actually happening. And here's what makes this even more infuriating. Jefferson and Brown admitted their scheme topped $3.5 million. But that's just one operation. How many other quote unquote fraud tourists came to Minnesota, stole millions of dollars, and never got caught? Because federal prosecutors made it clear these guys came to Minnesota specifically because they knew it was easy money, easy cash with little risk. And watch this. One of the supporters of Lester Brown showed up at the courthouse and defended his actions.
Nobody's been perfect. So mistakes happen. And we just hope God will forgive us.
Why do you think you picked Minnesota? Why here?
Mistakes happen. That's how she describes it. $3.5 million in Medicaid fraud. Not a crime, not theft, mistakes. Mistakes, she says. She claims she doesn't know why they picked Minnesota, but federal prosecutors know exactly why. Because Minnesota made it easy. Now, let me show you what happens to fraud tourists when they finally get caught, because the consequences here tell you everything why this keeps happening. Jefferson and Brown are looking at between 3.5 to 6.5 years in federal prison. 3 to 6 years in federal prison for stealing $3.5 million. Let's do the math real quick. If they serve the maximum sentence of 6.5 years, they stole $530,000 a year they'll spend in prison. If they serve a minimum of 3.5 years, that's $1 million per year in prison. And that's assuming that they don't get out early for good behavior or serve their time in some minimum security facility. But here's what really matters. They have to return the money, right? Wrong. There was absolutely no mention in any of the reports about restitutions. No mention that they'll be having to pay back the $3.5 million that they stole, because they can't. It's absolutely impossible. They'll serve a few years, get out, and potentially keep whatever money they didn't spend. And remember, this case only happened because somebody finally investigated. How many other fraud tourists, so-called fraud tourists, came to Minnesota, stole a bunch of money, and flew back to Philadelphia or wherever they came from without even getting caught? Because that is the pattern federal prosecutors described. People heard Minnesota was easy cash, easy money, so they traveled there specifically to commit fraud.
These defendants came here not to enjoy our lakes, our beautiful summers, or our warm people. They came here because they knew and understood that Minnesota was a place where taxpayer money could be taken with little risk and few consequences.
And you know what? They're right. Little risk, few consequences. These people stole $3.5 million, and they're looking at maybe 6.5 years in prison. That's a better return on investment than most legitimate businesses. Now, let me connect this fraud story to what's happening with ICE in Minnesota, because it's all part of the same pattern of Minnesota finally being forced to cooperate after years of protecting criminals.
We'll draw down 700 people effective today.
It's thanks to efforts by local law enforcement, Homan says, who agreed to cooperate and turn over arrested immigrants.
But here's why. Local law enforcement finally started cooperating. Counties that refused to work with ICE for years suddenly started honoring immigration detainers. Sheriffs who Tim Walz told to ignore federal law started turning over arrested illegals to ICE. And Homan is pulling out agents because the mission succeeded. 2,000 ICE agents are still in Minnesota. That's still 25 times more than the normal 80 agents. But Homan is reducing the force because Minnesota counties are now doing what they should have been doing all along, cooperating with federal law enforcement. And here's the connection to the fraud tourist story. Minnesota became a magnet for criminals, whether they're fraud tourists from Philadelphia or illegal immigrants committing crimes, because the state refused to enforce law. Tim Walz created an environment where criminals knew they could operate with little or few consequences. And now that federal pressure has forced Minnesota to change, the criminals are getting caught and federal agents can leave. Now, let me show you the most damning part of this entire story, because a Minnesota mayor just went on Fox News and said what everybody's been thinking this entire time.
It's crazy how there's been no one that's been so-called implicated when whistleblowers of fraud have lost their jobs and been fired by the state of Minnesota. I mean, if we're firing people that are reporting fraud, how is the Minnesota state government, the executive branch in particular, not implicated or complicit in allowing fraud to be rampant?
Listen to what he's saying. Whistleblowers who reported fraud lost their job and were fired by the state of Minnesota. So people trying to stop the fraud got punished, while people committing the fraud kept operating. The mayor is asking some obvious questions here. How is Minnesota's state government not complicit in allowing fraud to be rampant?
When fraud or mismanagement happens at higher levels and is allowed to continue unchecked, the consequences are pushed downstream. Every dollar lost to waste, fraud, and mismanagement is a dollar that can't go to roads, public safety, housing, or tax relief.
So while fraud tourists from Philadelphia are still in $3.5 million, Minnesota taxpayers were getting less services and higher taxes to make up the difference.
You know, it's just another blame game by the executive branch. You know, I have a family friend right here in Cross Lake who knows of a good friend who lost their job for reporting fraud at the state 5 years ago. So this goes back a long time that the state of Minnesota knew exactly what was going on, was trying to cover it up.
Minnesota has been covering up fraud for at least 5 years while firing people who tried to expose it. And remember what the federal prosecutor said about the fraud tourists that came to Minnesota because they absolutely knew it was a place where taxpayer money could be taken with little and few consequences. How do they know that? Because word gets around the criminal circles. When a state fires a whistleblower and protects fraudsters, criminals obviously notice this, and they come from Philadelphia to steal millions and millions of dollars. America, 2 fraud tourists from Philadelphia just pled guilty to stealing $3.5 million from Minnesota's homeless housing program by enrolling 230 fake beneficiaries and billing Medicaid for services that never happened. They used ChatGPT and other AI platforms to create fake records when insurance companies started asking questions. The first federal case charging criminals with using AI to commit healthcare fraud. Federal prosecutors said these fraud tourists specifically targeted Minnesota because they knew it was a place where they can get easy cash with little consequences. And they were right. Whistleblowers who reported the fraud got fired. Now Tom Homan is pulling 700 ICE agents out of Minnesota because counties finally started cooperating after years of protecting criminals. But a Minnesota mayor just said it's absolutely crazy that nobody in the state government has been held accountable for the fraud that's been happening for at least 5 years. Minnesota became America's first fraud tourist destination because Timmy Tampon Walsh created an environment where criminals knew they could operate with little risk. And now that federal pressure forces the state to change. Prosecutors are quitting, and hopefully the fraud stops. Let me know what you think about this. Drop it down in the comment section down below. Smash the like button if you kindly would. Share, subscribe, and as always, guys, I'll catch you on the next one.